The path toward Deir el-Medina leaves the cultivated edge of the Nile behind and enters a valley of pale stone, dust, and hard ground. Near evening, the western cliffs still hold the day's warmth, while the settlement ahead begins to lose its sharp outline. No river runs beside these houses, no field presses against the wall, and no broad avenue carries strangers through the center. The village stands apart from the green valley, close instead to the royal necropolis and the people who worked there. A few figures on the path are enough to suggest the village's purpose. Dust has settled into clothing. A hand remembers the weight of a tool. Around the middle of the 13th century BCE, during the Ramesside period, the inhabitants served the royal tomb project beyond the ridge. They cut stone, planned surfaces, placed signs, and added color, then returned to a settlement where family life left records of its own. This is a representative evening rather than a reconstruction of one surviving date. Attendance lists, letters, accounts, prayers, arguments, lessons, and delivery notes preserve the rhythms of the community, but they do not describe one complete night. They cannot tell us the exact sky above a chosen doorway, the meal in every house, or the moment each lamp was lit. The missing details remain missing. The surviving evidence is already rich enough to enter the village without invented ceremony. As the path reaches the settlement, the most important change is scale. The royal tombs may have been built for eternity, but the village is made of ordinary distances. A wall, a gate, a narrow street, a sequence of rooms, a jar set into a floor, a stair climbing toward a roof. The evening begins there, not with a pharaoh, but with a people whose hands translated royal plans into stone and pigment, then returned to homes small enough for voices, tools, and lamplight to remain close together. Even before the gate, distance explains much of the village's character. Water, grain, fuel, tools, and messages had to cross dry ground before they could become ordinary household things. A jar near a doorway, a donkey track, or a measured ration therefore belongs to the same historical world as the painted chambers beyond the ridge. Monumental art depended on small arrivals repeated so reliably that by evening, their results could look almost still. The ancient community called itself Setmat, the place of truth. The name carried religious and professional weight because its people worked within the sacred landscape of the royal dead. Deir el-Medina is a later name. In the New Kingdom, this was a planned settlement for a specialized workforce, but the first impression is not administrative. It is a wall, a narrow entrance, and houses standing close enough for one doorway to remain aware of the next. A wall enclosed the houses, and a principal street ran through the compact settlement. The village did not remain unchanged for 4 centuries. Houses were added, boundaries shifted, and religious buildings accumulated around the domestic core. What survives is therefore not the plan of one perfect year. It is a layered place, shaped by expansion, repair, abandonment, reuse, and excavation. Yet the repeated arrangement of connected homes still preserves the logic of a community built to keep people near one another and near their work. The settlement formed only one part of Deir el-Medina. Beyond the houses lay private tombs, chapels, and temples. The living moved through a landscape in which home and burial were close, though never identical. A family could leave the street and visit a chapel built for remembrance. A craftsman, who spent his working days preparing royal images, might also help create a tomb for himself or a neighbor. The village was not merely accommodation supplied by the state. It became a sacred and social world of its own. Near evening, the main street does not need to be crowded to show its purpose. Doorways face a shared route. Walls pass sound from one household to the next. A delivery entering the village can be noticed by several families before it reaches its destination. A child carrying a limestone flake, a water carrier returning with jars, and a worker with dust settled into the folds of his clothing all move through the same narrow geography. The place of truth is grand in title, but intimate in scale. The place of truth was planned, yet it never remained a diagram. Walls were repaired, rooms divided, houses enlarged, and chapels accumulated as generations changed. Near evening, those long changes are felt less as chronology than as closeness. Worn thresholds, shared sound, patched plaster, and roots learned by repetition. The ancient title gives the community dignity, but the street keeps that dignity human. It belongs to people who worked for kings and still had to carry water, remember debts, teach children, and return home. The royal workmen were known as servants in the place of truth. Their community included stonecutters, draftsmen, sculptors, foremen, scribes, guards, and other workers whose responsibilities changed across the long life of the settlement. The title did not erase hierarchy. Crews were divided, supervisors carried authority, scribes kept records, and specialist skill affected status. Yet, the tomb could not be completed by one gifted individual. It required coordination across many hands and many stages of work. Inside a royal tomb, teams could be associated with the left and right sides of the passage. Stonecutters opened and shaped the rock. Draftsmen laid out figures and hieroglyphs, often establishing proportion through measured grids and preliminary lines. Sculptors cut relief. Painters added color and corrected form. The sequence was practical as well as artistic. Each stage depended on the surface left by the one before it, so errors, delays, damaged tools, and unavailable workers could affect more than a single person's task. Literacy mattered in this environment. The images were not decoration added without reading. Royal tombs contained complex religious texts, names, titles, and carefully ordered scenes. Some craftsmen needed to recognize signs and understand how writing fitted the architecture. Village scribes recorded tools, rations, attendance, work progress, private agreements, and legal complaints. The result was a community in which writing extended far beyond the court, not because everyone held the same education, but because written order touched much of daily life. When royal work paused, skill did not disappear. The workers built and decorated private tombs, prepared objects, copied texts, taught younger people, repaired tools, and accepted work within the local economy. Their identities crossed the boundary between state employee and household craftsman. By evening, a hand that had drawn a divine figure for a king might return to a domestic wall, a letter, a small commission, or a child's exercise. The grandeur of the royal project was carried home in knowledge rather than in royal luxury. Status existed within the workforce, but no tomb could be completed by title alone. A foreman could coordinate, a scribe could record, and skilled specialists could guide particular stages. Yet the surface still required many hands and repeated checks. The village joined hierarchy to cooperation. At home, those distinctions did not disappear, but they entered narrower rooms where colleagues were also neighbors, relatives, creditors, witnesses, and worshippers. The same name could therefore appear in an attendance list, a private letter, a legal note, and a prayer without becoming four different people. The workers did not step directly from a decorated burial chamber into their own front rooms. The route between the village and the royal valleys crossed exposed ground and climbed through the western Theban landscape. At times, crews also used a work camp nearer the tombs. The distance helped separate the secure royal project from ordinary settlement life, but it also made every working day depend on movement, departure, arrival, tools, water, rations, supervision, and the physical condition of the people making the journey. No surviving note fixes the final footfall of one representative evening. Attendance records instead show the larger rhythm. Workers were present, absent, sick, engaged in family duties, or excused for reasons the scribe considered worth recording. Administration followed the workforce closely enough that a day away could become a line on an ostraca. This attention did not make the men mechanical. It reveals the opposite. Bodies tired, relatives died, eyes became painful, household obligations intervened, and work had to adjust. A return through the gate would therefore carry more than dust. It brought news from the worksite, questions about missing colleagues, requests for supplies, and the private relief of leaving narrow stone passages for open air. Tools might remain under official control rather than travel home. A worker's knowledge, however, returned with him. The proportions he had measured, the pigments he had handled, and the mistakes corrected during the day could remain in conversation long after the royal chamber was out of sight. The village was not a prison and should not be imagined as a secret military compound. Its separation served the necropolis community, but inhabitants took part in transactions, family networks, worship, disputes, and exchange beyond the wall. Evening narrows the scene without closing it. A water carrier may still approach. A message may enter. Someone may be absent because of illness or ritual duty. The working day recedes, and the settlement resumes the many smaller obligations that royal administration could record only in fragments. The return from the valleys did not erase the royal project. It changed its scale. Dust remained on clothing and skin. A tool might need attention, an instruction might need to be remembered, and an absent colleague might need news carried to a household. Yet the movement toward home also released the body from the measured demands of a tomb wall. The path descended from spaces designed for kings into a street where children, jars, ovens, annals, and domestic work established another order of importance. Deir el-Medina is unusually vivid because its inhabitants wrote on materials that were cheap enough to discard. Smooth flakes of limestone and broken pieces of pottery became ostraca, surfaces for calculations, letters, attendance notes, sketches, literary passages, receipts, and school exercises. Papyrus also circulated, but stone and pottery were readily available around a community of tomb builders. Words that did not require an expensive roll could be placed on a fragment, used, corrected, turned over, and eventually thrown away. The rubbish of the village became an archive no official monument intended to preserve. A royal inscription presents order in finished form. An ostracon can preserve the untidy process behind it. A missing worker, a delivery, a debt, a line copied by a student, a joke drawn by a skilled hand, or a letter asking a relative to pay attention. The surviving texts do not make every villager fully knowable, but they bring ordinary decisions closer than the polished walls of a temple usually allow. One British museum register covers 280 days in year 40 of Ramesses II. It lists workers and marks absences, turning time into columns of remembered presence and interruption. Another study shows how smaller daily observations were probably gathered into larger administrative records. Such documents were not diaries in the modern sense. They were working instruments. Yet because they name individuals and preserve reasons, they reveal the fragile human schedule beneath a project intended to last forever. By evening, writing appears in several scales. An official register may remain with a scribe. A private note may lie in a household. A child's exercise can be kept because correction is not finished. A sales record may wait for a witness or repayment. Nothing requires a formal archive room within the house. Writing survives because the community repeatedly needed memory outside the mind. A flake of limestone could hold tomorrow's obligation more securely than a spoken promise carried through a crowded street. Writing in the village was not a single profession sealed inside an office. It moved between formal administration and private need. A list could organize labor, a letter could request medicine, a receipt could protect an exchange, and a school exercise could preserve a literary line. The same cheap surfaces made this range possible. Limestone flakes and broken pottery were plentiful enough for temporary use, but the desert preserved many of them long after their immediate purpose ended. Their survival turns routine notation into one of the fullest archives of non-royal life from ancient Egypt. The village stood in an arid valley, and that choice made water a daily system rather than a nearby landscape. There was no canal running beside the wall, and no household well safely assumed for every family. Water had to be brought in by designated carriers, measured, delivered, stored, and protected from waste. The task connected the settlement to the Nile Valley through people and animals, whose work could be as essential as the labor performed inside the royal tombs. Ostraca preserved the practical edge of this service. Donkeys could be hired, delayed, injured, returned late, or disputed. Responsibility had to be assigned because a transport animal represented time, water, and value. These records do not describe a picturesque procession arranged for an evening scene. They show a working network in which a failed delivery or damaged animal could affect many households. The quietest object in a room, a jar standing in a floor hollow, depended on movement beyond the village wall. A carrier entering near evening would bring weight before sound. The vessel, the animal, and the route all resist haste. Water must arrive without becoming a spectacle, and once inside it is divided among uses that leave few dramatic traces: drinking, cooking, washing the body, mixing materials, and keeping the household functioning. Laundry and some other heavy services could be handled by designated workers, rather than by each family repeating the full journey to the river. Inside a house, water becomes architecture. Large jars are set where they are stable. Smaller vessels move from storage to hand. A cupful matters because the next supply has a route, a carrier, and an account behind it. Evening does not make the desert suddenly cold or the household free from thirst. It simply slows demand. The jar remains dark against a whitewashed wall, holding the Nile at a distance from the river and turning state organization into something a family can touch. When the delivery is finished, the soundscape becomes small. Harness fittings settle. A vessel meets the floor with a dull ceramic weight. Water moves once against the inside of a jar, then grows still. Nothing in this pause is abundant, yet nothing essential is missing. The road, the carrier, the animal, the account, and the household have briefly aligned. Before the dry rustle of grain takes over the rear rooms, the village is allowed one quieter measure: enough water close at hand. After the water settles, another dry sound belongs to the evening: grain shifting inside a basket or storage jar. The royal workmen were paid largely through rations, especially grain. Payment therefore arrived not as a small metal sum hidden in a purse, but as material that had to be recorded, transported, divided, stored, ground, baked, exchanged, and consumed. In an account it carried names, quantities, hierarchy, and delay. Inside a house it began a second chain of labor. Kitchen ovens stood in the rear zones of houses, where heat, smoke, ash, storage, and preparation could be kept away from the more formal front rooms. Archaeological and textual evidence supports grain, bread, beer, water, and oils as part of the village's supply world. It does not preserve one universal evening meal. Families differed, deliveries varied, and a household could supplement rations through trade or private work. The safest scene is therefore not a table laid with a perfect menu, but ingredients moving through familiar tasks. Grain must be processed before it becomes easy food. Grinding is repetitive, dusty labor. Dough requires water and time. An oven must be heated and watched. Beer production follows its own stages and cannot be reduced to a modern drink poured from a jar without preparation. Some service work was organized beyond the individual household, while other tasks remained inside domestic life. The village rested on a network of labor that continued after the royal crew left the tomb. Near evening, the rear room may hold residual warmth, even when active baking has ended. A basket is partly emptied. A jar is sealed or covered. The oven is no longer the center of attention, yet it explains much of the house's material order. Ash must be contained, fuel stored, grain protected, vessels washed, and food kept away from dust where possible. Rest begins not when every object disappears, but when necessary things have reached stable positions and can remain there until the next period of work. Grain also changed meaning as it crossed the threshold. In an account, it was quantity, date, entitlement, and rank. In the house it became storage, grinding, dough, heat, and food distributed across days. The documents do not preserve one universal evening menu, and the scene does not require one. The important transformation is secure. State payment entered a domestic system and demanded further work before it could sustain a family. The quiet rear oven belongs to administration and household skill at the same time. A typical house at Deir el-Medina unfolded in a line rather than around a large open courtyard. Passing through the entrance meant moving from one zone to the next, a front space with a raised platform, a central room, smaller chambers, storage, and a rear kitchen area, with stairs leading upward and cellars below in some houses. Individual plans varied, and walls changed over generations, but the repeated sequence shaped how light, smoke, movement, privacy, and household labor were distributed. The front platform was once described as a built-in bed, yet closer architectural study supports another interpretation: a house altar. This matters because the first room was not simply a place to sleep near the door. It could be a setting where household devotion, fertility, ancestors, or protective powers were acknowledged. Fixed architecture provides firmer evidence than loose objects displaced when the village was abandoned. The platform remains where belief was built into the house itself. Farther inside, a central column could support the roof. Walls might be plastered or whitewashed, with painted lower bands, niches, and false door forms. Water jars could sit in hollows in the floor. Tables, stools, tools, baskets, boxes, spinning equipment, and textiles occupied a room according to use, rather than modern ideas of decoration. A house was compact enough that one object often served several needs, and one chamber could change function across the day. Evening reveals the plan through decreasing light. The entrance room loses the brightness carried from outside. The central room holds practical illumination for longer. The rear kitchen keeps the memory of heat. A stair rises toward the roof, where air may move more freely, while storage below preserves what must remain cool or protected. The house does not separate work and rest with complete walls. It guides them along a sequence, allowing activity to recede deeper into stillness without leaving the household world. The roof extended the house without becoming a separate world. Stairs linked rear rooms to an upper surface that could receive air, light, work, storage, or rest under suitable conditions. Exact nighttime use varied and cannot be assigned to every family, but the vertical route changes how the interior is understood. A compact ground plan could still have layers. Warm air could rise, activities could move, objects could be carried above. The house managed climate and crowding through thresholds, height, and sequence rather than through large rooms. New Kingdom pottery lamps were simple objects, shallow vessels holding fuel and a wick useful because they made a small area visible without pretending to replace daylight. A Ramesside ostraca from the royal tomb environment records the distribution of lamps or torches and oil, showing that artificial light was a material to be issued and accounted for. That document belongs to necropolis administration rather than to one named house, but it establishes the practical world in which limited light had weight, cost, and purpose. Inside the village, a lamp should not be multiplied until every room glows. Fuel was valuable, smoke accumulated, and a small flame served best when placed near the task that required it. A person reading a note, repairing linen, checking a jar, or arranging a chest would draw close to the light. The rest of the room could remain dim. Shadow was not theatrical emptiness. It was the ordinary condition beyond the reach of one wick. The intact tomb of Ka and Merit preserves furniture, textiles, containers, tools, and personal possessions from an earlier Deir el-Medina household. Those objects cannot be moved without qualification into every Ramesside home a century later, yet they provide a rare view of the material range available to a prosperous family connected with royal work. Beds, chests, linen, vessels, and work tools belong to a world where household identity was expressed through useful things carefully kept. Near the end of the evening, the lamp narrows the household rather than enlarging it. One face is visible, another is only a voice. A box closes. Linen is folded away from dust. A jar remains in its floor hollow. The flame need not burn until sleep arrives in every room, and no exact extinguishing ritual survives for this composite night. It is enough to let the light become smaller as the number of unfinished tasks decreases. A pottery lamp did not illuminate the household evenly. Its value lay in concentration. A wick in measured oil could make a hand, a face, a written line, or the rim of a jar briefly clear while leaving the farther wall uncertain. This limited radius naturally slows the evening. People bring necessary objects closer instead of flooding the room with light. The lamp therefore supports the historical atmosphere without becoming proof of a fixed ritual. It is a practical technology whose small circle encourages the intimacy that modern viewers often mistake for decoration. Women at Deir el-Medina appear in letters, property arrangements, transactions, family disputes, religious practice, and the material organization of houses. The evidence is unusually rich, but uneven. Some women exchanged letters, although scholars cannot always determine whether they wrote them personally or dictated them. Their legal and economic presence is clearer than a simple claim that every woman in the village was literate. A careful account keeps agency visible without turning uncertainty into a modern slogan. Household work included storage, textile production, food preparation, care for children and older relatives, management of property, and participation in exchange. Spindles, weaving equipment, linen, boxes, jars, and baskets connect that labor to thresholds and rooms. Thread wound before it tangles. A vessel moved out of a passage. Cloth protected from dust. A basket placed where a hand can find it in low light. These tasks were not necessarily performed by women alone, and status affected who did what. Some heavy services, including water transport and laundry connected with the river, could be supplied by designated personnel within the wider necropolis administration. The title, Lady of the House, carried by Merit and many other women, recognized a social position within household life. It does not tell us every duty she performed, nor does it reduce her identity to a list of chores. In the compact village, household authority could involve property, inheritance, negotiation, ritual, and responsibility for people as well as objects. A woman might commission writing, receive goods, lend, complain, witness, or defend an interest preserved only briefly on an ostraca. Evening brings these forms of work together without requiring one ideal family. Near a doorway, a coil of thread is gathered, and a small container is shifted clear of the threshold. A textile tool falls into shadow when its use is finished. Lamplight catches the rim of a jar, the edge of folded linen, and the hand that checks what must remain for tomorrow. A child is corrected. News of a debt or relative is repeated. The household is not simply waiting for the male tomb workers to return. It has its own economy, authority, and memory. The record also warns against reducing women's work to a list of domestic objects. Property, inheritance, lending, complaint, correspondence, and exchange placed women within the legal and economic life of the community, even when male scribes produced many surviving texts. Textile tools and storage vessels show labor, but documents show decisions and claims. The evidence is uneven, and one prominent household cannot stand for all others. Even so, the village becomes more accurate when women appear as participants in household strategy rather than as silent figures waiting beside a loom. Deir el-Medina produced an exceptional concentration of school exercises, literary excerpts, corrected signs, and practice drawings. Limestone flakes offered a surface on which a teacher could write an example, and a student could attempt a copy. Some exercises preserve confident signs beside uncertain ones. Others show corrections made directly over the pupil's work. The village's high level of written activity did not require a grand school building, and archaeology has not securely identified one. Learning may have occurred through individual tutors, family relationships, scribal supervision, or small groups whose location changed with circumstance. The absence of a known classroom is important. It keeps the scene close to the household and workplace rather than importing a modern institution. A young person could learn signs from someone who used them professionally, copying names, maxims, literary lines, or formal elements needed for future employment. Education was not only about administrative lists. Roughly half the written material from the site is literary or religious, and some Egyptian works survive in copies found there. Students encountered texts valued for language, wisdom, and cultural memory. A future draftsman needed more than a steady hand. He needed to understand how words and images carried authority. A future scribe had to shape signs clearly enough that others could act on them. Near evening, a limestone exercise can remain unfinished without becoming a failure. The teacher's model is still legible. The student's copy may be reversed, crowded, or corrected in another color. The fragment is small enough to pass from hand to hand and durable enough to survive in a rubbish heap for 3,000 years. A child working beneath limited light cannot know that the practice piece will outlast the palace of the king, whose name it repeats. Correction was part of learning, not an interruption of it. A model could be copied, compared, and marked again. A sign could be enlarged until its structure became clear. Such exercises suited a community where visual precision had practical consequences. A misplaced line in practice was harmless, while a controlled hand on a royal wall carried greater responsibility. Evening study therefore joins childhood, apprenticeship, and professional continuity without requiring a formal timetable. The small fragment holds patience, an adult's example, a learner's attempt, and the possibility of doing better tomorrow. The work of a royal tomb began with stone. Copper or bronze tools, harder stone pounders, mallets, chisels, plumb lines, measuring rods, brushes, pigment containers, and lamps belong to different stages of construction and decoration. Not every object remained in a worker's house, and official tools could be issued, counted, repaired, or returned. The administrative record follows equipment because tools linked state material to individual labor. Draftsmen carried a particular burden of accuracy. They prepared outlines and hieroglyphs on surfaces where architecture, theology, and royal identity met. Red preliminary lines could be corrected before final work continued. Grids helped control proportion. Sculptors cut the approved forms, and painters completed color. The process was collaborative, but individual style still appeared. Figured ostraca from the village show formal studies, quick observations, humorous exaggeration, and the practiced ease of people who drew for a living. Stone dust and poor light placed strain on eyes and lungs. Splinters and repetitive movement affected bodies. A letter from the draftsman asks his son for honey, ochre, and black eye paint because his sight has failed him. The request is personal, yet it belongs to a broader occupational environment where vision was livelihood. The same hand that controlled a fine line could be made useless by inflammation or darkness. At home, a worker's tools may be fewer and more personal than the equipment at the royal site. A brush is clean. A small pigment cake is protected. A measuring cord is coiled. A limestone sketch rests beside household objects, rather than in a formal studio. Evening separates skill from production. The tomb is beyond the ridge, but the knowledge of how to make it remains in the room, held in fingers that now perform smaller motions and are finally allowed to be still. Maintenance gave tools a quieter life after work. An edge dulled by stone could be examined. A brush could be protected from drying. Pigment could be kept from waste. Cords and measuring equipment could be gathered rather than left tangled. The evidence does not place every official tool in a private room, so the scene remains careful about ownership. What matters is the dependence of extraordinary art on ordinary readiness. Before a line could become a god, a king, or a field of stars, someone had to keep the instrument capable of making it. The attendance records of Deir el-Medina are sometimes remembered for unusual reasons, written beside a worker's name. Their deeper value is quieter. They show that absence belonged to the normal management of labor. Illness, family duties, religious obligations, and other interruptions were tracked because royal work depended on people whose bodies and households could not be separated from the schedule. A missed day became administrative information rather than proof that the worker had ceased to matter. Research combining texts with human remains suggests a community that recognized occupational illness and maintained forms of medical support. The state provided rations for medical personnel and allowed subsidized sick leave within the workforce. Care was not modern health insurance, and the surviving evidence does not make treatment equally effective or available. It does show that sickness was visible enough to be recorded and organized, rather than treated only as private weakness. The draftsman pays request for honey, ochre, and black eye paint gives illness a human voice. He writes to his son because failing sight threatens both comfort and profession. The letter does not need graphic detail to carry urgency. A draftsman lives through vision. Dust, darkness, and stone fragments turn the most ordinary blink into a reminder that skilled work depends on vulnerable tissue. In the village near evening, care may be as simple as reducing light, bringing water closer, preparing a known remedy, or allowing a tired person to remain still. No one room contains the whole medical system. A healer, relative, scribe, and administrator may each hold a different part of it. The household receives illness first as a change in routine. A tool left unused, a meal moved closer, a message sent, or a name that will appear absent on tomorrow's record. Care also had an administrative shadow. When an illness removed a worker from the crew, the absence affected colleagues, schedules, and records as well as the person in pain. That connection helps explain why private symptoms and institutional notes can survive beside one another. The village did not separate health neatly into household and workplace categories. A sore eye could begin as dust and discomfort, become a family request for remedies, and end as a name missing from the day's labor. The evening holds all three scales without pretending that every case followed the same path. Religion in Deir el-Medina was not confined to the royal tombs. It occupied front rooms, fixed house altars, neighborhood chapels, private tombs, and the surrounding mountain landscape. Amenhotep I and Queen Amos Nefertari were venerated as patron figures of the community, and images of them appeared in household settings. Their presence linked the origin and identity of the village to rulers, remembered not only as distant monarchs but as protective powers. The mountain itself carried divine meaning through Merit Sagar, she who loves silence, a goddess associated with the Theban peak and the necropolis. Ta, patron of craftsmen, also held importance for people whose lives depended on skilled making. Household devotion did not reproduce temple ritual on a smaller scale in every detail. It created local points of contact, a platform, a niche, a stela, an offering, a spoken appeal or a gesture made before work and sleep. The private tombs above the village joined memory to architecture. An underground chamber received the dead, while a mudbrick chapel remained accessible to the living. Families could maintain relationships through offerings, names, images, and visits. The artisans who created royal afterlives also designed their own places of remembrance. Their private tombs often display the extraordinary skill of workers who understood sacred art from daily practice. At night, devotion does not require a dramatic vision. A small flame near a house altar is enough to make the fixed platform distinct from the wall. A name is spoken softly. A cup or morsel may be placed where it can serve as an offering, though no exact household ritual is imposed on this composite evening. The mountain beyond the roof remains dark and silent. For a community living beside tombs, silence was not emptiness. It was part of the sacred geography that held work, fear, protection, and memory together. Domestic devotion could make protection feel local. Royal patrons, craft deities, ancestors, and the sacred mountain belong to related but not identical forms of reverence. A fixed platform inside a house is valuable evidence precisely because it cannot easily be moved from another room and assigned later. It anchors belief to architecture. Yet a surviving platform does not dictate one family's words or gestures. The most honest scene allows the household to pause near a place made for devotion, while leaving the exact prayer beyond recovery. A compact village produces closeness, and closeness produces both support and friction. Deir el-Medina's texts preserve loans, sales, prices, inheritance, accusations, witness lists, property claims, and letters between relatives. The community was not peaceful because conflict was absent. It remained functional because disputes could be spoken, witnessed, written, reopened, and sometimes settled. The same neighbors who exchanged goods might later appear on opposite sides of a complaint. Private business often moved between oral agreement and written record. A donkey could be hired for water transport. Grain or household objects could be valued against other goods. A promise might be secured by witnesses and then summarized on an ostraca. Writing did not replace trust. It preserved the shape of trust when memory, distance, or disagreement made speech insufficient. A small text could carry the names of people who expected one another to remember tomorrow what had been decided today. The surviving documents tempt us to build a village of vivid characters, but caution remains necessary. A letter can illuminate one relationship without representing every household. An object associated with a named worker cannot always be assigned to a specific room if its excavation history is uncertain. The ordinary night narrative therefore keeps named individuals where the evidence is strongest and allows the wider street to remain populated by roles rather than invented biographies. Near evening, a dispute does not need to erupt. It may survive as an object placed aside, a note waiting for a witness, a measure to be checked, a borrowed tool not yet returned, or a message repeated through a doorway. The street grows quieter, but obligations remain awake. Tomorrow's work depends on more than the royal tomb. It depends on neighbors who can lend, carry, testify, repair, teach, and remember even when they do not agree. Because the settlement was small, memory itself had social force. A promise could be known by neighbors before it was written, and a written note could become important because those same neighbors might later testify. Reputation, kinship, work hierarchy, and material need overlap. This did not create perfect accountability. The surviving disputes show otherwise. It created a community in which obligations rarely belonged to only two isolated people. By night, a debt could remain unresolved, while daily cooperation continued, held in place by witnesses, records, and the practical necessity of meeting again. The village has never been a frozen scene from one perfect year. Houses were changed, chapels added, objects moved, texts discarded, and later generations used the site differently. The evening assembled here belongs to the Ramesside world around the middle of the 13th century BCE, but it remains a careful composite. Its strength comes from the agreement of architecture, objects, administrative records, private letters, and human remains, not from pretending that one surviving document describes every room at once. By now the principal street holds fewer movements. The last water has been placed where it can be reached. A rear oven gives back a little stored warmth. An exercise rests beside its corrected model. A lamp illuminates only the nearest hands. Beyond the wall, the royal valleys are invisible, though tomorrow's obligations still point toward them. The great tombs depend on this small settlement, and the settlement depends on grain, water, care, writing, memory, and ordinary cooperation. Nothing dramatic enters the gate. No strike begins, no tomb is opened, and no royal messenger changes the course of the night. Those events belong elsewhere in the long history of Deir el-Medina. This hour is valuable because it remains ordinary. The people who built eternity spend part of their lives closing jars, folding linen, treating sore eyes, correcting signs, settling accounts, and finding enough darkness to rest. The lamp becomes smaller. Mud-brick walls hold the day's warmth a little longer. A roof stair leads toward cooler air, while cellars and inner rooms keep their own silence. Somewhere in the settlement, a limestone flake carries a name, a lesson, or a debt that no one expected to survive. The royal tomb beyond the ridge was made to resist time. The village left another kind of record: worn thresholds, discarded writing, repaired rooms, and the ordinary evidence of people who supplied eternity with working days. At last, the nearest hands withdraw from the light. A lid rests on a jar. Linen lies folded. The corrected limestone flake waits where it was left. Neither monument nor treasure, only a small obligation carried into tomorrow. Beyond the mud-brick wall, the western ridge has become darkness. The king's painted chambers remain out of sight. In the village below them, warmth leaves the walls slowly, voices fall away, and the place of truth no longer needs to explain itself. Work will return with morning. For now, the roofs, the doors, and the narrow street belong to the night.